All right. So yeah, my name is Koren. I'm a product manager at Facebook. I'm on the product foundation team, and I manage performance across the core app. So like Facebook.com, iOS, and Android. And it's a really interesting role because it's a very horizontal product as opposed to a vertical product like you think of like events or groups or something where you're like really owning a space. Obviously performance is, it spans across all of our products. So it's pretty interesting because I get to work with a lot of other product teams on ways to improve their products. I'm going to talk a little bit about my background tonight because I think it's relevant to the conversation, and then give you some tips for people who are aspiring PMs or want to learn a little bit more about how to get into product management, and then talk about some of the things that I've learned, over the past few years as a PM that I wish I'd learned, as a new PM, or that I wish I'd known as I started my career in product management. So I was a litigator. I handled multi-district litigation, which is like when you think of really complex litigations like the World Trade Center or GM or like a pharmaceutical litigation where you have, a ton of plaintiffs and like cases filed across all 50 states and like how does that get coordinated? And I think like the role of a really good litigator in those situations is to be able to take a ton of evidence, whether it's like deposition testimony or, evidence in a variety of other forms, and figure out like what is the story that we want to tell the jury, and like how do we take all those different data points and craft a story that people can really like get behind. And I feel like that's sort of like the same thing I do now, just in a really different form. So I won't really talk about the reasons that I didn't want to practice law anymore, because I don't think that's particularly relevant, but I'll just, say that I was fairly unhappy. But I do have some fond memories of my legal career. So I wrote a lot of legal briefs, and apparently liked posting them on Facebook. I don't know, not that cool. Got to speak at like some really cool conferences. This one was in Vegas. I would not recommend going out the night before when you have to have your head like that large on a projector screen. That's a little scary. I got sworn into the Supreme Court by all 9 justices, so that was a pretty fun day. The last trial I worked on had a $9 billion verdict, which was, I think, the 7th largest verdict in history at the time, or in U.S. history at the time. So really cool. It went up on appeal. I wasn't practicing anymore. I didn't see any of the money. So not sitting on like a very large wad of cash right now. And I got this really nifty plaque to hang in my office back in the days when I actually had an office. I do not anymore. But as I mentioned, I was pretty unhappy, and it's a really hard thing to admit to yourself that you're unhappy, especially after so many years, of investment, not just with practicing, but, the amount of money you pay for law school and all of that stuff. So, took a little while to kind of swallow that pill. In 2012, I started a blog when I was living in New York. I wrote about travel and things to do in New York City, and it was just this really fun creative outlet for me. Hi, welcome. Sorry to call you out. It started as a blogger blog, and then I switched it over to a free version of WordPress, and then I switched it over to the self-hosted version of WordPress when I couldn't really do what I wanted with it. And I remember this one day, I was like trying to change something in the theme, and it was a search box, and I wanted to change the color, and I went into the CSS file and changed the hex code, and it turned pink, and like I republished it, right? That's like not even real coding, but I thought it was super cool, and it was such a small moment, but it actually ended up being a really important moment. So I left my legal practice in 2014, but I spent the last 2 years of my practice learning to code. I taught myself front end through Treehouse and just like various other online resources. I want to make sure that doesn't go off again. I learned how to like operate WordPress really well to manage the blog that I had. I started doing some freelance work for friends who needed websites, like I need a really simple website or I need a blog set up. I took CS50 at Harvard, which taught me data structures in C. I don't think that's necessary, but it was interesting. And then I learned some other things like Photoshop and Google Analytics and just things that I needed to manage the blog that I thought were interesting, that I had really no understanding, of the relevance that they would have in my life today. I quit my job in 2014. I went to Flatiron School in New York, which is a coding boot camp in New York City. They were just purchased by WeWork, so you may have heard of them. And I learned Rails. I went very rogue on the curriculum. I didn't really want to like do all the labs and like learn how to code really well. I just really wanted to build things. I had all of these ideas, right? So by the time I graduated from Flatiron, I think I deployed like 8 Rails and Sinatra apps. And, I was blogging the entire time that I was learning to code at a separate blog. So like all of my product specs were online. And I think like there's a few articles that still show up first in Google if you search for certain things, which is pretty cool. And then I built like an online portfolio to showcase all of the apps. So within a few weeks of graduating from Flatiron, I had 3 job offers as an engineer. So I took my first software engineering job at J.Crew in New York City, where I spent a year as an engineer, have like a bunch of fond memories from working as an engineer. I rebuilt an internal email tool and sort of served as the product owner on this tool because it was internal and, you know, they didn't really have anyone managing it. So if you got a marketing email from J.Crew at the time, it probably went through this tool. I rewrote the shipment confirmation emails for Madewell and J.Crew. So if you order anything from Madewell or J.Crew now, I wrote that email. It's cool because like my own email comes back to me, but as an engineer working on emails, like not really that cool. And then my team won an award for the most impactful hack at the hackathon for a redesign and personalization of the J.Crew homepage. And then I had an article published in JavaScript Weekly on Backbone, and it crashed my blog, which was like the best day of my life at the time. But I was still pretty unhappy. I knew pretty early on that engineering was just a medium for me. It's fun. I really just wanted to build good products. I didn't really like sitting around and refactoring my code or making sure things like were performant, which is, you know, what I do on the product side now, which is super fun. But, you know, there was definitely something I knew pretty early on when I was learning to code and when I was at Flatiron that product was going to be a better fit for me. But I, like many of you, like really needed something to bridge that gap because I don't think that I could have moved from law to a product role in, you know, the same way that you can potentially move from engineering to a product role. So when I first started applying for product jobs, I faced a ton of rejection. You know, recruiters wouldn't talk to me because I don't have a product manager on my resume, which, you know, if any of you guys are going through the same thing, like very common. I think it's a really difficult job to hire for. So I think unless people know that you have the experience, you know, they're just less willing to take a chance on you than like a new engineer. They can pull up, look at your GitHub, look at your code, and like actually see what you've been up to. So I basically, you know, worked my network. I've, you know, been practicing law for a variety of years, have a lot of connections, and that's where I got all of my interviews from. So I'd suggest that, you know, you guys think about that as well. I ended up making it to the final round of Microsoft Yammer in San Francisco, and then they told me 2 weeks later that they hired someone with more experience. Another very large tech company that I won't mention by name wouldn't even interview me with a referral because I didn't have PM on my resume. And the feedback was I hadn't demonstrated my ability to take a product from inception through completion, which, you know, I didn't necessarily agree with, but that was the feedback that I got. So as you know, I am a PM now, so there is a bridge and you can get there. But I do like to be open about all of the initial rejection I faced because, I don't know, it's just part of the process. And, you know, I don't think it's an indicator of future success at all. And I don't think it's, you know, an indicator that if there's something that you really want to do, you shouldn't necessarily go and do that. But it does take a lot of work to overcome that. So just something to keep in mind. But there is a happy ending to this story. So I had a friend who was a senior PM at Yahoo in LA when Dollar Shave Club reached out to her, and she was pregnant at the time, not looking to change jobs, and referred me. And the VP of product at DSC looked at my background and kind of just, you know, saw the full picture. You know, I had a successful legal career, I had management experience, I was able to code and design, and he read my blog, and, you know, all my product specs were online. I also already worked at an e-commerce company, and I was going to another e-commerce company, so there's some parallels there. Had a handful of interviews with them, flew out to LA for the final loop, and accepted my first product job. And lots of fun memories from that period of my life. So I moved to California, launched a lot of great products with a really awesome team. I was there when DSC got acquired for $1 billion by Unilever, so that was a really fun day. Had my name in the paper, and they spelled it correctly, which was awesome. And now I'm a PM at Facebook, which you guys all know. So I guess when I think about this period of my life, I think there's two just overarching lessons, you know, before I get into actually talking about product management, which is, you know, surround yourself with supportive people. Like, there's always going to be people around you that tell you that you can't do something or that, you know, you're not qualified. It's just, you know, it's not worth listening to those people if you think that you found something that's really interesting and a good fit for you. And then, you know, stop ignoring the nagging voices if it's something you're thinking about doing, but you're not really ready to take that step, because eventually you'll look back and kind of wonder, like, what would have happened if you just put in a little bit more effort. So, all right, cool. So I love being a PM. It's super fun. I've been really, really happy, you know, especially compared to my prior career. And the most common question I get is, you know, how do I make that same transition? And I think, like, the first piece of advice I would give is demonstrate earned leadership that's resulted in measurable impact combined with a handful of relevant skills. And I'll break this down for you a bit more. So the first piece of advice, and I think the most important piece of advice, is you really need to be able to sell yourself. You need to make someone else see your vision, right? So you should be able to articulate why you want to be a PM and be able to articulate your value add, because it's become a very trendy career for some reason right now. And I think like when you really get down to it, being a good PM is about being able to craft a narrative that people will buy, right? So you need to kind of like PM yourself and PM your job search in the same way that you would PM your product once you have a product, right? So the first question that I usually ask people is, why do you want to be a product manager? And you get a lot of varying answers, some which are good, some which are, well, it's all subjective, right? But I've gotten answers like, I want to build products, but I don't know how to code, or, I want to work in a cross-functional capacity, or, just a variety of other like very general responses. And, I think there's a lot of jobs that you can work in a cross-functional capacity or get like a lot of similar types of experiences that don't necessarily mean that PM is the best fit for you. And if you compare that to like a response like, I was a data scientist and I realized that every time I, pulled data, I was making product recommendations. Moving into the PM role allowed me to be closer to the product and like have, a more active role in the direction of the product. Or I used to work in finance and I realized that a lot of the financial tools are really antiquated and, I just saw so many areas for improvement and they want to go work at a fintech startup. Those are things where you're not only like very clearly articulating why you want to be a product manager, you're also saying like, hey, I have this special thing that I can bring to the table that other people don't necessarily have. So I think that's, before you even start to think about all of your other skills, you should try and craft your narrative. It will also give you an opportunity to figure out where there's gaps in your narrative. Like if you can't explain to someone else, like, here's why I want to be in the role and here's why I think I'm a good fit, you maybe need to take a step back and like develop some more skills so that you can actually have a narrative. Cool. So I did mention some tangible skills. I think if you look up anything online about becoming a PM, they'll tell you that these skills matter. So I won't talk about them too much. Coding is an interesting one because I haven't written a line of code other than like on personal projects since becoming a PM. And I think the level of technical expertise that you need to have varies from company to company. So some companies are really like MBA focused. Some companies are very CS focused. And my guess is everybody else is sort of in the middle. I think what's really important about the technical skills is understanding like how the internet works and how a product is built and how a product is deployed and actually like get somewhere, right? Because you're going to be working with engineers to actually like figure out how do we like build and release this product. And you don't need to know how the code works, but you need to have an understanding of like what the general level of effort is, or like, is this thing possible? Or, whatever your tech stack is and like interesting things about your tech stack. So I think coding is definitely something that you should spend time learning, but I wouldn't over index on like learning a particular language or like anything like that. Design is something I think like you should also be pretty well versed in. If you're going to be a product manager, you really need to know like what makes a good product and like why does a product feel good or feel bad in like the design sense. And then obviously data. I think at different companies there's differing levels of data science. Some companies, if you're the first PM and it's a small company, like you're going to be running all of the data by yourself and like you really need to be well versed. At larger companies, obviously I have a data scientist that I can work with, but I still need to sometimes like pull up reports and look at things and like just understand what those trade-offs are. So the more you can kind of build yourself up in those skill sets, the better.
Could I add a fourth one?
Go for it.
Understanding how the law fits into the product and how it can shape the roadmap or potentially get the company involved.
Sure, I think that's important for companies. I don't necessarily think that's the number one, I wouldn't put that up there as something that PMs should be well versed in. I think,
What would you say that?
Because I think as a lawyer, you should never really like delegate out to someone else making like decisions on what's legal. Ethics in terms of like the law, I think is something that you should really have a lawyer that you consult with, and I would never advise a PM thinking that they can manage that on their own. So, it's important for a company to have that. I don't necessarily think it's that important for the PM to know that. But there should be a lawyer on hand if there's something that you are worried might not be ethical. So if you're looking for additional ways to stand out, because obviously, I think every PM or aspiring PM is probably going to learn some sort of technical literacy and, some sort of design literacy. I think there's a handful of other things that you can do. Obviously, if you know how to code, and you know how to design, and you can build an app and actually deploy it and let people see your design process and your building process, that's awesome. But it's not necessary. I think blogging is a really great way for people to understand how you think about products. And, if you can start a blog and blog about, technology that you're interested in or products that you like or don't like or how you potentially improve those products, I think that's great. Or publishing code on GitHub, really anything like that. I think being a PM is a really hard thing to hire for. So the more tangible things you can actually have to let people evaluate, the better. Otherwise, it's super hard to look at a resume of someone who hasn't actually launched a product and figure out if they're a good fit. Domain knowledge is another huge one. I definitely think going from JCrew to DSC really helped me, because even though I was an engineer at JCrew, I worked at an e-commerce company and I absorbed all of that knowledge and saw everything that we were releasing. And I ended up working with the same third party at JCrew to build the reviews platform when I was an engineer that I ended up launching at DSC as a product manager. That was my first product that I launched. So I think that's a huge deal. And it's also something that differentiates you. If you have prior finance experience, you might have better traction at a fintech startup, and if you limit your search that way. And then I think leadership by influence that's resulted in impact. Do something. I think being a PM is so much about leadership and being able to get buy-in and really drive something forward. So even if I think people in general want to hire people who have had prior success. And even if that prior success has been in another domain, it still works in your favor. So the more you can do things that say hey, I took this thing, whether it's large or small, and I really drove that forward, the better. Cool. So when I was putting this deck together, I was thinking, all of the advice is well and good, but if you're not actually getting interviews or a chance to actually show people, what your experience is, it's, it's hard to show people that you can actually do the job. So like I said, I think networking and referrals is probably the biggest thing you can do for yourself. If you don't have anyone who can refer you, I think you should go to meetups, go out and just try and meet people in the industry that can, get a better feel for who you are. I also think just as a comment, a lot of companies, they have a referral tool and you can refer someone, and a lot of them ask quite a few questions about how you actually know someone and, if you can vouch for their work, etc. So you may get a referral to a company and it may have your resume reviewed closer to the top of the stack because it's going through a referral process. But it's always better to get someone who can actually vouch for your work versus someone random, just because you usually have a space to really give some additional information about someone. And I don't think the referral is particularly strong if someone says, I've never worked with this person, or I don't really know how well they can do the job. And then another thing that I think is really underrated, I've never seen anyone do it, but I would do it, if I wasn't getting traction and was having a more difficult time when I was job searching. Just suggest an improvement for the company. I think this could work whether you're networking or applying cold to a company or whatever. But especially if you have to send a cold resume and you have no other connection, put some time in to really review the product and say, I've reviewed the product, or I love your product, but, here's what I think you could do to improve it. Or I've noticed this problem with it and here's how I think you could solve it. And if you're an engineer, mock something up, or if you're a designer, mock something up, or, just put together a one sheet on why you think it would be a good idea. I think that could really set you apart from every other application they're getting. And also, if it's a good idea, you've just really raised the bar on your resume, which doesn't necessarily have any product experience on it. So, I think it's underrated. You can't do it for every single job that you apply for. You're going to probably do that all day, but yeah. So I spent a couple years at Dollar Shave Club as a PM, learned so much about being a PM there. Very different from where I work now. They were a startup, they got acquired, it's super crazy and hectic in very different ways than my current job is super and hectic. I've been at Facebook for almost a year now, and obviously I've learned a ton at Facebook as well. Facebook has a very engineering and product-driven culture, unlike, some other companies where, maybe marketing is driving strategy a little bit more. But yeah, I want to walk you through some of the lessons that I learned in the last few years as a PM, especially working at two very, very different types of companies, that I think can help you at any level in your career, but especially if you're interviewing or you're a new PM or you're looking to hire a PM, I think they're particularly relevant. So the first lesson is you own the narrative for your product. So, I think as a PM, sometimes you look around you and you're like, data owns the data and engineering owns the code. Like, what do I own, right? And I think that you own the narrative for your product and the future vision, and you own the roadmap, right? So I think that like a lot of people, when they're thinking about getting into a product role, they're over-indexing a little bit on learning process. Like you'll hear about like agile or waterfall or all of these different things. That's fine, but frankly, at Facebook, we have no process. We have no process that we have to follow. And, we had a very like loose process at my former company. And, and a lot of times you'll have a TPM, a technical program manager, or a project manager who's actually like driving process for you. So you don't really have to learn that. And I don't think it really gets into the essence of, what a product manager does, which is like actually owning the narrative and the roadmap. And I think there's also some confusion over, what the roadmap is. Like, what would you guys say the roadmap for your product is, out of curiosity? Open question, not rhetorical, but I'll also answer if nobody wants to talk. Cool. So I feel like a roadmap can easily kind of get watered down into, I want to spend the next like 3 months or 6 months doing X, Y, and Z. And your roadmap should have that on it, but your roadmap really should be like, where do I see the vision of my product in 2 years? And what do I need to be doing in the next 6 months of my like actual future roadmap to make sure that we get there? But what I think is left out when, you think about what a PM's role is and building the roadmap is your roadmap shouldn't just be a series of features for your product. Your roadmap should also say, like, what research do we need in order to make sure we're moving in the right direction? What data do we need in order to make sure we're moving in the right direction? So that you're not only building features throughout the course of, the quarter or the half or however you build your roadmap. At the end of the half, you've also said, like, we built all these features, they perform this way, but we also learned all of these new things, and that's going to shape the way we plan for the next, 6 months or 2 years or whatever that looks like. So it really should be like a holistic 360 view of the future direction of your product. Go for it.
At Facebook, what's the roadmap duration? Basically, like, there is a vision and there is a roadmap. What is it like? Is it the product within 1 year, or it's like?
So we usually talk about, where do we want to be in 2 years? As far as what the roadmap includes, we usually do planning at the beginning of each half. So it's the work for 6 months. And, you're not necessarily locked into everything that's on your roadmap. Obviously, if you learn new things, you can always pivot, but you do try and plan for a 6-month period with the understanding of like where you potentially want to be a little bit further out. So your job is not to make decisions, but to make sure decisions are made. Deb Liu, our VP of marketing, recently said this in Forbes, and I thought that was it just really resonated with me. And I want to read a little excerpt from the article. So, I witnessed a product manager who clashed with his engineering team over and over. After seeing their dynamic, I pulled the product manager aside and asked them what was happening. He said, "I don't understand why they won't let me own the roadmap and prioritization. That is my job." But he was wrong. It doesn't matter who makes the decision in a cross-functional team, product manager, designer, data scientist, researcher, or engineer, as long as it leads to a great product outcome. A fixed sense of who you are and what your role is means that you cannot adapt and grow based on the needs of the team, and it will be a major barrier to success. So I think there's this common misconception that as a product manager, you're making all of the decisions, like what you say goes, and you set the roadmap and everybody just has to go and execute. I think that's a really poor way to lead your team, which kind of takes me to my next lesson. The best PM partnerships aren't territorial, they're true partnerships. So in my current role, and I think this happens at a variety of companies, it's really hard sometimes to tell the difference between me, the PM, and my TPM, my technical program manager, and my EM, my engineering manager. We all kind of have a seat at like what's the future of the vision of our product table. And at any given moment, I think we could each take, some of the work off of each other's plates and, execute fine on that. We obviously all have our core competencies. I'm not going to go, tell the engineering team how to implement something. And, there are things that an EM wouldn't do that a PM would do. But I think we can get in a room and we can say, okay, here are all the things that we have to do. I'm going to take this piece, you're going to take that piece. And there's definitely like overlapping roles. And I think if you get really stuck on, I'm the PM, I need to be doing this, like you're the engineer, you're the marketer, or you're the researcher, like, stay in your lane, you end up with a very, very poorly functioning team that just doesn't trust each other. So, the more you can kind of like remove that territorial nature to your work culture, I think like the better products you'll build. And along the same lines, engineering should really be your partner. At my first my first engineering job, my only engineering job, I don't think that was really the case. Granted, I was a very junior engineer, so there could have been things going on that I wasn't aware about, but I always felt like there was a feature that was going to be built, someone else designed it, there was research behind it, whatever it was, and it just kind of landed on engineering's plate. And obviously, once it was built, if there's like questions about implementation, engineering was brought in, but it shouldn't really be like that. You could end up in a case where design spends all of this time designing something, and they give it to engineering and they're like, we can't implement this because of A, B, and C, or there's a much easier way to do it, or have you thought about this? So they should definitely be involved in the process. I think it removes a lot of like implementation issues that you could have later on, but they also bring a really unique perspective to the table. We're looking at everything from the outside in all of the time, but they're looking at everything from the inside out all the time. So, even though like they're not actually like looking at the product necessarily, they have a lot of opinions that are very interesting and, they're things that you wouldn't necessarily think of. So I think the more you can partner with engineering, the better. And at large companies like Facebook, that's kind of driven into the culture. I mean, it's a very engineering heavy culture. But if you're at a smaller company and you're kind of thinking about like what you want your culture to be, you should definitely feel like engineering is your partner. Cool. So you have to scale yourself. So if you come to a large company like Facebook or, really any company where you want to expand your scope, you're going to have to start delegating things as a PM, which I think is really hard because I think PMs tend to naturally be very type A. And, I'm definitely guilty of this right now. If I think something's not getting done, barring it's like writing code or something, I'm just going to go and do it myself. And I think that isn't great, and it's not setting me up for success and, the best way to be set up for success. You really need to rely on the people around you. And I think that kind of goes to my former lesson, about kind of divvying up the work and like really trusting your team and stuff. Ideally, you can increase your scope quite a bit and have your hands in quite a few things if you can just figure out, how do I rely on the team around me and like trust in their expertise that the right decisions are getting made. Cool. And then the last lesson is imposter syndrome is real, but it can be overcome. So I think if you come to any company as a new PM, you're going to have like a certain measure of imposter syndrome where you look around and you're like, am I in the right role? I have no experience. Or maybe you come to a large company like Facebook and you're like, half my team went to Harvard or whatever it is. I don't think that's true, but I definitely had a lot of imposter syndrome when I got to Facebook. And I think there's two ways that you can approach this. Obviously, you can focus on the negative energy, and if you kind of let that like creep in, you're just going to be stagnant. You're not really going to move forward. Or you can really use it as an opportunity to humble yourself and learn from the people around you, because the more that you're questioning like your own value and like whether you're making the right decisions, the more you're going to listen to the people around you, which I think is a really important skill that a PM has, to like sit in a room and be able to say like, what does everybody else in the room think before you actually, give them your opinion. And so yeah, I think if you really lean into like that feeling of imposter syndrome, I think it can actually make you a really successful PM. So that's it. Thank you so much for having me. I hope that I was able to give you guys some value or, teach you something new that you might not have thought of before. Obviously I'll be here right now to take questions, but I'm more than happy if you like find me on my website or ping me on LinkedIn, to continue the conversation and answer any questions you have. I get a lot of requests to like get on a 20-minute phone call or like meet for coffee. My schedule is super busy, so, I'm more than happy and I'm always super responsive via email. But just be mindful of, if you really want information, I'm very quick to respond via email and not very quick to get on the phone. So, yeah, go for it.
I'm specifically asking about Facebook. Like, let's say you come up with a feature and you pass it on to the engineering team, and you just want it, like, how do you evaluate the time? Because the engineering might say, oh, this is going to take like months, but you as a product manager, you want the product to be developed like in 1 month. How do you like communicate this with the team, with the engineers? Because it's sometimes it's hard, especially in this startup environment.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't think you can ever like make engineering move faster. I mean, if you want to condense something from 3 months to 1 month, you're just going to end up with a lot of people who are working overtime, or you need to hire more people. So I don't really know how to speed that up. I think there's a couple other questions that like are maybe better questions to ask, which is, how do you take something that was of 3 month scope and take it into 1 month scope because you need to release something within 1 month? That's a different question. And I think, obviously it depends on how polished you want your product to be. But I think for me, like the way I think about an MVP is, release the smallest feature that you can that is like adding value, but also gives you actionable data, right? So, when I say adding value, I mean, it meets the objective that you were trying to meet. So like, if you want to sell products and you're not really sure if they're the right products, you don't necessarily need to make like a super polished website, but you could make something that, sells like a certain category of products and will give you a sense of like, are consumers responding to these products? Are they the right products? And then if they are, like, you can kind of build your site around that. Does that answer your question? And I also think like you would never really just hand something to engineering. They should be involved in that process early on. And like, I think the PM's job is really to say like, here is the objective of this feature. Here's the people problem that we're trying to solve, or however you want to frame it. And here's the time that we have, what can we do within that time? And then work with like the designers and the engineers to actually figure out what we're going to build versus like, let's build this feature out and then hand it to engineering, which I think that's not a great process.
The product team always wants the product to be done like today. They want it out today, right? And the engineering always is kind of delaying. I'm not saying they're lazy, but they want to take their time.
Yeah.
And some features can be released like within 1 day, but it takes them like longer time because that's how.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that also depends on what's holding up the development process, right? Like, I think you could potentially get something polished that doesn't have test coverage and it, is potentially buggy and isn't built in the way that like they would like to build it for the long term. And I mean, I don't even necessarily think it's good to wait for that because you could spend 3 months building something and it fails and, you have to iterate and you don't really like have, you'll never get that time back. So if it's a matter of like engineering wants it to be built in a certain way, it can be built in a slightly different way just to get the product out and like see if there's market fit. I think that's a compromise that you could make with engineering to say like, if this is a market fit, we'll give you the time to go back and refactor the code and actually like build it in the way you want now that like we know that the time is going to be well spent.
Okay. Yeah, so we're coming a bit more from like the hiring direction. I'm actually like really pleasantly surprised to see all the legal technology people on here. So we're building a legal technology company.
Oh, nice, cool.
And so I guess my question specifically is around the domain expertise, right? So I know there's broad levels of like, okay, cool, you worked in an e-commerce company, B2B. I think sometimes we have this bias in terms of these attorneys turned product managers or product people. And in terms of making a hiring decision, right? Like, if we have someone with slightly more experience, but really no domain experience in the legal industry, and someone who used to be an attorney and really understands like the nuts and bolts, and then also has like, medium level of experience, how much of that domain expertise in one sector truly like play into how we favorably look upon that candidate?
So I think there's kind of two ways to respond to that. The first is I don't necessarily think like the number of years experience matters. I think it's the quality of the experience, right? So you could have someone who like has really good raw skills and has launched like some really kick-ass products and they've been a PM for 2 years. And then maybe someone who's like been a PM for 10 years, but like kind of mediocre companies, like you don't really like understand what they built or it's just not particularly relevant. And I think you should go with the person that like you feel like has that like better raw skill. I mean, it's tricky in like, I guess the legal fields because there are so many like interesting nuts and bolts there, but it depends honestly on what you feel like is more valuable for you. Like, I think that any PM can come in and like pick things up and like they may need to learn a little bit more. But if I felt like the PM without the domain knowledge was like a much better fit for the job, I wouldn't not hire them because someone else has like more domain knowledge. But I do think domain knowledge can transfer. So, you know, it's something that like can help you get your foot in the door. And I mean, I manage performance now. I came from e-commerce. You know what I mean? It's like so different, but I've picked up everything that I need to, and it's been totally fine.
So this is sort of in response to that question as well, our question. So I worked at a legal startup in sort of quasi-product role, and the CEO was also an attorney. So to your question, I think if both the product person and the CEO are attorneys, that can lead to some tension. Whereas if the CEO is not an attorney, then it's helpful to have an attorney with some legal background at least in a PM role.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't want to monopolize it too much, but yeah, but I think one of our concerns too is the people who are purely product tend to be a bit more bullish, but people that tend to come from product and a legal background tend to be a bit more like, oh, I don't know if we can do that because of X, Y, Z reason.
I rely on lawyers to...
Yeah, and so that's kind of a tension too that I don't know if you experience.
I mean, I would say in something like that where I don't really know what your product is, but you could end up in a situation where, you know, the person who has the prior legal experience is thinking about things more from like say it's a marketplace, more from like what the lawyer wants out of the marketplace and like less about the consumer. But if you bring someone else in, like they may have like a less biased opinion on like what the actual consumer wants. So yeah, I mean, it really just depends on like what's a fit for your business. I think there was a question right there.
So if you come from technical background and let's say you have 10, 15 years of technical background with coding, design, everything, how as a PM do you prevent yourself or stop yourself from not getting into technical conversation or have a strong opinion about whatever they're coding? How do you prevent yourself?
So, I mean, I think I don't think it's bad for the PM to be involved in the technical conversation at all. I actually think like it's a huge asset. But yes, you don't want to be prescriptive as a PM. Your job is not to like tell the engineers how to build things anymore. I think if you have a good relationship with your engineers, they'd probably welcome that because I think it's valuable. But yeah, I mean, it's something that you just have to kind of understand that you're losing in much the same way that like I don't try and think about the legal aspects of my product anymore because it's not my area of expertise, and I'm going to grow in like the areas that I need to grow in and let someone else who's, you know, an expert in their field take that.
I'm curious to know what qualities you've noticed in software engineers who successfully transition into PM role. I'd love to know, like, what are the qualities you display, and how can someone go about displaying this point?
Yeah, so I think that it's really about taking ownership, right? So Facebook's an interesting place because the engineers are very self-sufficient. And I think there's a very large pool of engineers at Facebook who could become product managers. And when we're actually thinking through a feature, sometimes the engineer will actually, or a lot of times the engineer will actually write up the requirements. And I don't have to do that. So I think if there's something that like you're interested in doing, like sit down and actually write up the requirements, you know, you're more than qualified to do that and say like, I have this idea, or, you know, just take more of a leadership role in like the products that you're already working on and, you know, try and lead your team to like build those products and get buy-in for it. And if it's a really good idea, like, you know, try and work with the PM in order to actually like get that built.
So just to follow up.
Yeah, no worries.
And for someone to actually make the transition, do you think it's better to just let it happen organically, or is it something that you should start talking to your mentor or your manager about that? Hey, I really want to move into PM, or just...
No, I think you should be taking affirmative action on that. I don't really see how it happens organically. Like, you know, I think there's some engineers that would think they're leveling up if they're moving into a PM role, and there's some that actually would think they're leveling down, depending on like what type of company you work at. So if it's something that you're really interested in, I would definitely like seek out opportunities to work in that capacity. Yeah.
I think so. As someone who's working on like Facebook or like a really big company, just wanted to learn like what kind of tools we have around you, like that makes your life easier as a product management. Because I came from a really small company, not a lot of stuff around, especially when it comes to data stuff. So that I would like to hear if you have like some stuff that you're using. And
so we use all internal tools. We don't use any sort of external project management tools or anything like that. We have an internal task tool. You don't have to use it. And like I said, you know, we don't really have like sprints in the same way that you think of in like an agile process. So Yeah, I mean, you can kind of use whatever you want as long as it's internal. We also use Workplace. So Workplace kind of functions just like Facebook, but it's for work, and it is a product that we sell to third parties. Like I think Walmart uses it. I'm not 100% sure. Functions just like Facebook. So if you think about like having groups and how all of that works, that's kind of how we manage everything and all of communications like within Facebook as well.
One follow-up question, and while the decisions are made about the product, what would be the percentage of like you use a lot of data, or you do a lot of custom interviews, or what would like usually in like a company like that, what's the
There's a lot of data and there's a lot of research, and I think it really depends on the product that you're working on. Some products are going to have like a lot of data components and not really that much research, and other products are going to be very research heavy if the area is particularly gray or if you don't really have much data. So yeah, I mean, I think they're both equally valued, and it depends on the product that you're working on. I want to skip over here a little bit because.
So how do you know you've hit an MVP?
So. Yeah, I mean, people can define their MVPs in a variety of different ways. Personally, I think it's the smallest feature that you can ship. This is just my own personal way of thinking about this. It's the smallest feature that you can ship that meets the objective or solves the problem, which will also give you actionable data. So there's two things. Like if you release a product that, isn't actually solving the objective and like it doesn't have the features that you need to actually like see if there's market fit, your MVP is just sort of like a watered down version of what you were going to build. And if it doesn't give you actionable data, there's really no point. Like you don't know if you should move forward or not. So I think that the mistake people make with an MVP is saying like, we have, 5 components of this project. Like we can only have time to build one. So we'll start with like the first one in the sequence, but that may not be like where you need to be to actually understand if there's market fit. So does that make sense? I know it's kind of like very high level without like a concrete example, but that's how I think about it.
I have 2 questions. One is, and they're kind of related, but one is your product is performance, and I'm curious to know like what that means.
Sure.
As like a product.
Yep.
And also for like large and small companies, what's common in like the number of products that PMs will hold? Or like the number of PMs on one product?
Okay, so first question, what performance means is when you open the app or you go to the website, how quickly do things load? Really, it's as simple as that. I think the reason you need a PM and you don't just have an infrastructure team working on this is so much of performance is about perception, right? So it may be that like something's actually like quite performant when you look at the data and how quickly something's loading, but people still don't feel like it's fast. And that's because like the loading state is inconsistent, or, the way that things are like loading in on the page, like doesn't feel good and it feels like they're kind of wonky. Or you could have things that like feel really good from a design perspective, but are actually like really slow. And if you kind of audit your site and figure out like what's going to actually like change the perception of people's performance, and what's most important to our users, like that's where you kind of get into like a lot of the product thinking and why you need a PM on it. But yeah, it's not your traditional product. I don't feel like I'm missing, working on a traditional product right now because I spent 2 years at a very like design heavy company. So, sorry, what was the second question?
Oh yeah.
Forgot.
That's really helpful. The second question was, I guess both of them kind of have to do with like how different companies define the product.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, yeah.
And, like,
how many PMs on a?
products you might have.
So I don't necessarily think that you should divide up your PMs by product, because some products have a really small scope and some products have a really large scope. I think you should divide it up by like the scope of the work and the complexity of the work. You could break down like one product into different subsets and like the scope could be really large for all of them, or like you could have one PM managing, an entire product if it's relatively small in scope. Again, like kind of a hard question to answer in the hypothetical, but do you feel like?
Yeah,
Okay, cool. Back there, I had your hand up.
Thank you for coming in and talk. The question I have for you is, you come from very different background to PMing specifically. How do you successfully bring forward the skills and the experience in the resume and in the interview process to say, hey, I'm a lawyer and I come from a technical background, but I can totally do this?
Yeah, so I mean, I feel like that's sort of what I just walked through at like a high level, but like I said, like I think that you need to kind of craft your own narrative, right? So like, I think for me, I had built a ton of apps. Like, I was blogging the whole time. Like, you could go online and like read all of my like coding like specs and all of that. So I think for me, like, the transition was very, very organic, and it resulted in a situation where I didn't necessarily have to like explain things to people as much as someone else who's like really trying to make a leap will. But I mean, honestly, I think so much of it is just like being able to like get someone to buy into your narrative. You know, like I faced a ton of rejection until someone was like, okay, this kind of all makes sense to me. But I think the best thing you can do for yourself is to be able to say like, what's my unique value add and why do I want to be a PM? And if people are like, cool, that actually makes sense. I totally get like why you'd be a PM and like why you'd fit. You know, I think cold applying with just your resume, it's just tough in general. It's tough even if you're a PM to get a new job as a PM with like a cold application. So if you're not getting traction because of cold applications, I would maybe just try and change your process a little bit versus thinking that like you're not qualified or don't necessarily have the right skill set.
Thank you, that's perfect.
And I don't really believe in summaries on your resume, but I did put a summary on my resume when I was transitioning roles, because otherwise, like, someone looks at your resume and it's like there's no consistent thread. So you should figure out like what's your consistent thread and like put it up there, and maybe at least will color someone when they're looking at your resume. Yeah, in the middle, yeah.
So why performance? What interests you about that, or were you just looking for a product role in general? And that's the first thing?
Yeah, I mean, great question. So I really wanted to optimize for, you know, a really good team and a good manager when I joined Facebook. I think that's the best thing you can do for yourself and like your career development. So I actually almost worked on another team that like, you know, I just didn't get like as good of a feeling about like their work environment and their process and their culture, even though the culture, I think, across most teams is really good. My current manager was one of my interviewers. So I think like as soon as I joined Facebook, he reached out to me. And by the way, do you guys, okay, let me take a step back actually. So at Facebook, most PMs come in as a generalist and you go through allocation once you get to Facebook. So I didn't apply for like a performance role. I applied to Facebook, or Facebook reached out to me. I got the job at Facebook, and then you go through allocation and you meet with teams once you're there. So you actually can get like a feel for like whether a team, you know, feels good. And my team just felt good and my manager like felt good.
Sorry, follow up to that. How do you evaluate the culture specifically?
I mean, if you're talking about like, do I want to join this company? Like when you're going through an interview process or something. I mean, I would honestly just ask people, but I would also ask people about how it is working with like your partner teams and how it is working with your specific manager. You know what I mean? Like, do you like working with your manager? Do you think that they're like have your career growth in mind? And then figure out like who like the most important partners are to you. Like at my former company, marketing was like our partner. You know, I think when you have a physical product that you're selling and you sell it on your digital platform, there's like a lot of overlap between like who's actually driving the strategy, and like that would be a partnership that I would probably want to like dive into a little bit more.
So what are some of the hardest questions?
Sorry. Oh.
Okay. What are some of the hardest conversations you've had to have like as a PM with your teams or otherwise?
That's a great question. I mean, I think they probably center around like someone really, really wants to build something, and it's like maybe, you know, a personal like project for them, or like something they feel personally passionate about, but it's just like not going to end up on the roadmap, and like not feeling like you're isolating a particular team member. And, you know, obviously like everyone has a voice, and I think like everyone's opinions are really important, but you can't do everything. So yeah, just kind of not making them feel like it was anything personal or. Did you have another?
How often you release, considering you say that you are not using any sort of framework that's strong like
How often do we what?
Do you release your product? Like you go through the development. Like how often? Per week? Every 2 weeks? Every week? Every week?
So on web, we have continuous deployment. So the site is consistently updating, and, you know, we have ways of not making it, you know, obviously we have a lot of cached content, so the site updating all the time would make like for a really wonky experience. So we have like ways so that you're not actually seeing like refreshed site features all of the time. But we do have continuous deployments. And I want to say it's like a weekly schedule on mobile, but I'm not 100% sure about that. And then we also have like, you know, tiers of like the way things get released, but I'm not really sure what's proprietary, so I don't really want to delve into that too much more. But
And PM is the ultimate accountable person for delivery, or
no, it's engineering, I believe. Yeah.
So, since performance is an internal product, so most of the analysis or the decisions that you make comes from the data, based on the latency or throughput.
Sorry, when you say an internal product, I don't necessarily agree with that, but I'm curious why you're saying that.
Because on what basis you determine the roadmap or the features in terms of performance? Because it is all about throughput, latency,
There's actually a lot. So if you think about, a product team trying to release a new product, we could potentially block that product from release for performance issues and work with them to actually improve the performance of their product before it's released. But as a PM, I think, a large area of my focus is how do we make things feel faster? So that actually includes changing features and, changing loading states and changing the way things load, regardless of whether you ever change the actual latency.
And do you, how often do you, do customer interviews?
Customer interviews?
Yeah.
I don't do them at all. Our research team does that. Yeah. Right behind you.
So the transitioning process. I don't know if you do hiring now, but if you've just seen it, apart from just not having the qualifications you discussed earlier, are there any other things that you can identify as disquals? If you meet somebody, you interview them, and you're like, oh well, this person can't be hired. You wouldn't hire them.
No. I mean, nothing that I can think of off the top of my head. Yeah. Nothing specific to the PM role, at least. I think there's things that generally disqualify people from getting jobs, but yeah, in the back.
So my question was, someone is responsible for product requirement document, someone else is responsible for the business requirement document. So when you do your roadmap, how do you mingle them?
So those aren't actually terms that I'm really familiar with, to be honest with you. I know what a product requirement document is, and I guess you'd call them user stories, etc. A lot of times engineering will write those at Facebook. I wrote them all at my former job. But, there's no formal process on how to actually write those right now at my company. The business requirements doc, I'm not 100% sure what you mean by that.
So sometimes there are functional and technical, some engineering teams like to call it, oh, this is just the byproduct. For us, we have to add X plus Y plus 1. But for the business user, it's just click. What I'm saying is totally different, but basically how to build them. It's unclear because I go through, so we don't have a product requirement document, but we have a business requirement document.
That's what's the objective of this? Why are we building it? What's...
Yeah. So the vision of the product was just a one line.
That's what I would call it, our roadmap, I think. And then the roadmap would usually link out to individual product specs.
So where we got challenged is when the marketing team said, where is this and how are we mapping our metrics to the releases? And we were like, we are not doing that. So, so I think there was some relation between the product and the business, so that's why I asked you.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, you should definitely, with every release, part of what you're trying to understand is, I think before you release something, you should have an understanding of what metrics will factor into understanding whether that product is a success. So I personally wouldn't release something without an agreement on what are we actually trying to do with this product and how will we know if it's successful. And did you have a question in the back? I feel on the end. Did you? Oh, okay. Sorry.
Just curious, how many PMs are
A lot. At least a few hundred, I think, and I feel we're hiring more, but I don't know the exact figure. But yeah, it's quite a few.
And I have a question. So I really like what you said about having a cohesive narrative, right? Owning the narrative. One challenge that we've had is knowing when we hit critical mass for the same narrative being socialized amongst everyone. An issue we've had is people are sort of operating with different levels of knowledge. having been at the company for different levels of time. And so the narrative becomes slightly different for everyone. So the narrative that like the PM has or that marketing has doesn't end up being the exact narrative that's implemented on the engineering side. And so I'm wondering if you have any sort of like tips or tricks to make sure that like your entire team is executing on like a cohesive narrative.
Yeah, when you say like when engineering's like executing the narrative, it's a little bit different. Like what is the like result of that? Like what's actually happening that you see that makes you know that they're executing on something different than what was asked? Or
right. So an example is more like the back end architecture, right? So we might have like in our system like a single engagement, right? And they're sort of architecting for one final payment made at the very end.
Gotcha. Okay.
In reality,
So
there needs to be multiple payments.
Sure, but that's not exactly in the feature that you wanted to ask them. So that's why, to be honest with you, that's like the exact reason that engineering should be brought in, like as you're having all the conversations. Like, I think that you've just illustrated a perfect problem for like, hey, we set this direction and like we said that like this is what we wanted to get built. And we didn't bring engineering in, and that was built in a way that like isn't necessarily scalable for the future of our product. With that said, I also think that's like on the PM. Like if you know the future of your product is that you are going to eventually have like multiple payments, even though like the feature you're currently releasing only requires one, like that should be in your product specs. It's like a pretty important detail. So yeah, I mean, I think it's on you to also make sure that like they're getting all of the information that like they need to architect the product in a certain way.
Do you have a sense of, for people who are making this kind of transition, whether small startups versus large corporations might be a better segue or more open to bringing on people who don't have vast years of experience in product?
Yeah, so I have a few thoughts on this. My first thought is you should try and get experience somewhere where you can get mentorship, because I think like that's the best thing you can do for yourself early on in your career is to have like a manager or someone on your team that like you're learning best practices from, that like your company that is at least like asking the right questions and like thinking about the product in the right way. Because you could spend like a year at, being a PM at your first startup and you haven't like really learned how to like think about a product in a way that like is going to maybe propel you into like your next role. With that said, like any experience is good experience. So maybe like you'll make a jump. I've heard, and I don't know if this is the case, that like you may be able to get like an earlier stage startup to take a chance on someone who like has less experience. And I mean, you may potentially get paid less as well than like someone experienced. But again, like you'll learn a ton, like you'll wear a lot of hats, but you won't necessarily get like the mentorship that you would at like your company. You could get that from somewhere else. Large companies sometimes have like an RPM program or an APM program that you can get into if you don't have prior experience. Facebook definitely has one for anyone under 2 years of experience that like is smart and can do the job. And I think what we're really looking for is like product sense and execution. Like, what is your process if we give you a really ambiguous problem and like we watch you think through it, and can you execute like once you figure out like, the direction of the product that you want to build? And like it's very focused on like raw skill versus experience.
So besides all those data-driven solutions that you were just talking about, like getting the product or features by following the MVP strategy to the level that it will create enough data for you, do you also use another kind of techniques like personas or just imagining yourself or putting your personality dealing with the product to see what exactly you feel like or something comes from your own perspective?
Yeah, I mean, of course. I think as a PM, like you should have like a strong sense of where you feel like the product should go. But I think you can kind of get into like a hole and end up as a bad PM when you get like really attached to that vision for your product and there's, conflicting data or you're not asking the right questions. And then like you've released something that's like you're personally attached to without, thinking outside the box and thinking about like, what are the questions that I should understand to even understand if I'm like building the right thing. So yeah, I mean, I think a strong sense of your product is important, but you don't want to get like locked into that without the ability to kind of like look at it with fresh eyes.
How much do you utilize UX research in your data?
All the time. Yeah. Very consistently. They're like amazing. Yeah.
Is it
very helpful.
embedded in your mapping?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, definitely. Like part of the roadmap that I worked on for, my product, for the half says like by the end of the half, it says the features that we want to build and like the goals that we want to hit and the metrics we want to move, but it also says, here's the research that we really want to understand by the end of the half. Like, here's some additional data points that we don't yet have that we need instrumentation for. And research is pretty integral in like really understanding your product. Was there someone? Okay, sorry.
Do you, couple of questions. Do you travel as part of the job? Is travel a huge portion of the job?
I travel very little unless it's a research trip or like I need to go to other offices to meet with people, but yeah, not too often.
Okay. And do you directly meet customers to get the requirements or
If I'm on a research trip, I may, but otherwise, no. I mean, UX is well equipped to handle that. But again, I work for a large company, so there's, very defined roles. At a smaller company, that may be different. Like you may actually step into each other's roles a little bit more like that.
Can you talk about any resources you use along the way to help you strengthen focus or blogs?
I definitely read Cracking the PM Interview when I was like interviewing for jobs. But my experience was really organic. So, I don't think that I woke up one day saying like, I want to get into product. I started learning to code and building things and was like, this is super fun. Like, what's the role that actually like kind of defines like what I'm already doing and thinking about? I can't really think of anything else. I definitely read like a handful of design books, like, to figure out what actually like makes good design. Like there's some good books on like visceral design and how people actually like get that immediate feeling like when they touch or feel or see your product and like how to kind of think about that in your product thinking. Obviously I learned to code, so there's probably like some books mixed in there somewhere. Yeah.
So how do you weigh two candidates, one with MBA degree or one with more work experience?
I want to be careful about saying this. I don't have an MBA, so personally to me, I just don't, I think it's great if you got one. I think that you evaluate them based on raw skill. I think experience and things like that get you the interview, but that shouldn't be what gets you the job. Like you should get the job because you can think through a product. And, if you're interviewing or something, like you should actually like be thinking through like your product with the people you're interviewing with. You know what I mean? Like tell me about how you'd improve like this product or, like give them an ambiguous problem and see if they can like think on their feet in a way that like makes sense to you. Any more questions? Awesome.
You're just talking about the roadmap and the way that you gain it from probably upper level management and.
I don't think I said that. What's your question?
And, do you split the roadmap to epics? I'm guessing, like the small pieces, something like the feature you are planning to develop.
That's not really what I consider a roadmap. That's more like I think what you would do on like a product spec document or something. You'd figure out like. But again, I think that's a very like agile term to talk about, and I've never really used that at either of the companies that I've been a PM, so that's not part of my work. Yeah. I think like process is good if it works for your company. I don't think it's necessary to build products. It's just a really good way to stay organized, so figure out like what works for you and tweak it, as necessary.
After having that much like product management experience, I know it's not that much, but
no.
Yeah, definitely,
Yeah.
Do you ever feel that you might actually like start your own business and run the whole like the business as a product, because that's mostly you kind of like CEO of your product?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the first product manager for a company is really their founder. They're just not called the product manager; they're called the founder. For me personally, like I don't really have that drive at this time. I would love to have like a pet project, but I don't think I want to rely on it as like my full income. But maybe that'll change in the future. I'm happy where I am for now. But a lot of PMs do take that route where they become founders. So
that's why I asked, because a lot of people they either have done it already or
they switch or yeah.
So I can throw out that there's a bunch of great podcasts on product management. I'm happy to share those with folks. Those are always great.
Yeah, I've never listened to podcasts, so that'd be cool.
And Twitter accounts.
Awesome.
factors that you consider in deciding the features that need to be put next, or deciding when framing the roadmap? So what are the different factors that you consider in your team?
So, like, I think for me, and again, you know, I don't want to say that every product manager thinks this way, but like, I feel like I like to really stretch things and figure out, like, where do we want to be, like, back here? Or if you're talking about a specific feature, like, you know, let's stretch that as far as we can and figure out, like, if we could build everything and it was amazing, like, what does that North Star vision look like? And then you can kind of work backwards and figure out, like, what are the first steps that we need to take in order to, like, really execute or, like, learn more about, like, whether we're moving in the right direction. I think if you kind of start over here a lot of times, like, you're like, oh, this feature seems important, or, like, but you're not really, like, questioning whether it, like, actually ladders up to some larger vision. So I think if you kind of start out here and work your way back, that's a really good, like, benchmark for whether you're building the right things.
So do you like test on a pilot of pilot users? Like how do you test whether this feature will be
I can't hear you. Oh my God. And I totally just broke Sam's rule of not repeating the question, and now, like, nobody's going to hear the questions. Sam, you should have stepped in here. I'm supposed to be repeating the question so that the microphone can hear it, but I haven't done it once, and now it's been like a half hour, so. Anyway, keep going and I will repeat it.
sure. You can hear me, right?
I can hear you.
I mean, I can figure out if you don't. So how do you test whether a feature will be worth shipping, right? So do you test on a pilot users? Like, what are the different criteria that you use?
It really, I think, depends on, like, what the scope of the project is. Like, if it's something really large and it's a massive change, you know, you'll probably do, like a, what's it called? Not a mock-up. What's the word I'm looking for here? What? No. A prototype. Thank you. I'm like, why am I not able to remember that word? You'd probably prototype it out and, like, research it. But if it's something small enough that you can, like, get into production, you'd probably just test it. Did you have a question?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So has mentorship played a role in your PM journey? And if so, how did you find your mentors, or how did they find you?
Yeah, I mean, great question. So I think I had a really good VP, and I guess he's a VP now, but director of product at Dollar Shave Club. And they were, like, pretty instrumental in, like, kind of teaching me how to do things and, like, really, like, focusing on my career growth. And, you know, that's not that surprising given my VP kind of was, like, one of the people who looked at my story and was like, this makes sense. Like, I could really believe in this person. I think they can be a success. So we're still really close, and, like, you know, we'll ping each other for questions sometimes, like, even coming the other way now, which is cool. But yeah, I mean, I think for the most part, like, it's like dating or like friendship. Like, you need to have, like, a mentor fit, right? So I think, you know, there are some ways, I guess, where you can, like, hire a mentor and stuff like that, but you don't really know if, like, they're going to jive with your personality. Like, I think the best thing to do is to kind of find someone who you feel like you can connect with and, like, is willing to help you, and just let that grow organically. But yeah, I think it's important. Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you guys so much for coming. I really appreciate it. Hope I was able to add some value. And